I want to first thank you all for being here today as we talk about an issue that not many of us know very much about. And this is going to be a great opportunity for us to sort of collectively pool our information so that we can figure out just a little bit of what sequestration means and what does it mean to us here in Monterey County. I first want to thank the panelists for being with us today. Congressman Farr, Captain David, Fred Meurer, Norm Groot is going to be joining us, and Elliott Robinson. You'll find their bios in the program that you received on your way in. Secondly, I want to thank the supporters who've made this day possible for us. We were fortunate to have support and sponsorship from First 5 Monterey County, from Community Foundation for Monterey County, the Nonprofit Alliance of Monterey County, Embassy Suites in Gastonbury. Now, people ask me, why are you doing this? And the purpose of this summit is really to educate us as well as we can and to also raise awareness of the community about the seriousness of this issue. What the snapshot of the local nonprofits showed from the poll that was done is that the safety net of our county is really going to be seriously impaired by sequestration. And I'll give you some examples of how that plays out. One of the things that the poll showed is that there are some direct reductions and also delays in where agencies had significant reliance on federal dollars. There's also more competition for non-federal funds. There also is a decrease in client resources for income, and therefore there's more pressure put on, again, the non-federally funded programs. But the area that bothers me particularly, because I see it more than some of the others, is on housing. HUD programs are going to be impacted most immediately, and I think it's one of the areas that absolutely places more anxiety on people's lives. That's something that we have. And I can tell you just from United Way's perspective, we administer the Emergency Food and Shelter Program. So I know that's going to be a problem as well. Another program that United Way does is the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program through the, with the IRS. We bring back more than $2.5 million to the county. That's an economic driver in our county. If those funds are impaired, what's that going to do to that program? Just some examples of what we know are going to be happening. So now let me just tell you a little bit about the format for the day. We're going to have opening comments from our Congressman Sam Farr, and then we're going to have, each person will have 5 to 10 minutes to talk a little bit about their information and the parts that they know about. We've specifically chosen people who have information in their own sphere of influence. At the end of all of the speakers, we'll have the opportunity for some questions from the audience. And there are 3 questions that we've already received that we'll be asking our panelists. And I think you also received information on cards when you came in. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you could just jot it down, we'll have some folks from United Way circulating to pick them up. This would not be an event at all if it weren't for the support of the wonderful staff and the Board of Directors of United Way. And I really want to specifically thank Fatima and Katie and Tina, and I see Ashley's here, and Yuri. So many people that really put a lot of effort into making sure that we could have this program, and I thank you for that. As we begin to talk about this, I want to talk about the very first example of sequestration that we talked about. You may notice that we don't have anyone specifically from education here. Nancy Katowski wasn't able to be with us today, but she did ask me to bring these 3 points forward. The sequestration impact on migrant education. We know that there's going to be a reduction of 1 summer intervention program. It's geared to support high school students with math and science. It's a big loss to us. The sequestration impact on Head Start. In our county, it equates essentially to about a $500,000 loss, which means 5 employees and 26 slots for kids. The impact on sequestration countywide is about a $6 million hit to the overall school districts. And then sequestration impact on special ed, there are so many different programs that are funded through the federal government for special ed. And the reduction of federal dollars is going to have to be backfilled by an increase in the bill backs to our local districts. That's when it starts to get into government speak, and it's above my pay grade, so forgive me for that. But to start us off today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our Congressman, Sam Farr, who I must say has been a friend of mine for more than 40 years. Sam does an excellent job in caring for all of us. He's dedicated his life to public service, and for that I think we all owe him a great debt of thanks. Sam?
Thank you very much, Mary. Actually, I attribute my success in politics to Mary. She was my first campaign manager in 1975, 38 years ago, when I got elected to the Board of Supervisors and served in the position that Supervisor Fernando Armenta, who's here today, served. So thank you very much, Mary, for then, and thank you for now for being here. Sequestration is a word that's in our vocabulary. It's new. What it means is across-the-board cuts. It's just a fancy federal word for cut, squeeze, and trim. And it's really only been around in dialogue for 2 months because it triggered on March 1st of this year. And how it all came about, back in 2012, we were trying to raise the debt ceiling, which is a routine procedural vote that Congress has to do to raise the ability of us to borrow, the federal government to borrow money to pay bills. And it takes an act of Congress to do it. And in that year, the conservative new kind of right wing of the Republican Party came in and said, we're not going to give you the routine vote. Although we'd have passed it, it was always the party of majority that had to carry the responsibility, and they had the votes to do it, but couldn't put those votes up. So we ended up creating a budget act that year that did some conditionality. First was to create a committee within the Congress of 6 members of the House, 6 members of the Senate, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats on each side, to come up with a list of recommendations of how we could reduce the deficit for the United States. Good thing. And since it was all our own members and members who had strong backgrounds, and they would really be able to do this. The committee met and listened to all the experts of the world and ended up with all kinds of recommendations, but they couldn't get a vote to pass it on to Congress. So in the same bill that created the commission, there was an insurance policy, a trigger, so to speak, saying if this commission can't do its job, and everybody thought it was going to do it, let's just have a sequestration kick in 2013. And it was sort of the gun to the head of the commission, you better do this because nobody can accept cross-the-board cuts. Well, our politics in Washington has been just stuck. We're all stuck. We can't find politics is the art of compromise. We can't find the art of compromising. And so it kicked in March 1st. Now what's interesting is that we had adopted the budgets for this year, which is 2013. We do that last year. The federal fiscal year runs from state and county governments are July 1 to June, June 31st. There are 31 months? No, 30, June 30th. But the federal government's fiscal year is from October 1st to September 30th. So we adopted the budget that cut the budget back to 2012 levels. Now, think of in your own life, if you could only spend the income you had in 2011, essentially freezing everything, you wouldn't be able to pay your CalAm bill, which has gone up, or your garbage bill from Waste Management, or any of the cable bills. All those things have gone up since 2012. Those are fixed costs. I argue why they need to increase them when the inflation didn't increase in this country, but nonetheless, those companies did raise them. So what you have to do is you say, well, I'm going to have to cut somewhere else. And where you do in the federal government, because we have the same costs for gasoline, energy, and all those things, you have to cut people, because that's where the only place you can find some savings. So what happened is that the agencies were really scrambling to figure out how do we live under 2012 budget restrictions, cutbacks, and then on March 1st said, oh, by the way, there's another 5% added. And that's across the board. And the question that Mary asks is, what's the impact of sequestration, is the same question that those of us in Congress are asking in our budget hearings of every person that comes before us is, what does sequestration mean to you? We don't even know yet in the federal agencies. Some of them have been doing such good work at just cleaning up bureaucratic costs, more efficiencies, that they've been able to find savings in that and saying, you know, we can live with this. Now when sequestration hits, they say, well, because our fiscal year ends in September, you're asking us to cut 5% more in the next 7 months. We've got to do it all in a 7-month period. It's going to be really difficult to find those savings in such a short time. It's a disaster. And as the feedback from that disaster comes, and I will claim that frankly that disaster feedback is coming from Wall Street, it's coming through the military, is that we cannot carry out our mission because half of those sequestration cuts have to come from the military. And we can't take a hit like that. And even though Leon, when he was a member of Congress, was a big fiscal hawk, he was, when he was Secretary of Defense, was saying, this is too big of a bite. We can't accept it. So, and Wall Street, because we procure so much equipment from private sector, corporate, you know, all the equipment in feeding and tanks and guns and planes and everything, Congress was pushed to make an exception for the military. So we came back in and gave the military $10 billion more and said, by the way, you have flexibility. You can determine. It doesn't have to be across the board. And just last Friday, we did the same thing for air traffic controllers because the airlines, they were claiming, well, it's because all the Congress members wanted to get home. We were flying to Washington the week before and certainly faced those backlogs. But it was really the airlines that came in and said, this is causing total havoc. And what we didn't give them any more money. We just said, go rob the fund that you have for airport improvements. You can use that money, and you have flexibility. So you can hire back or it's not necessarily hire back, you can bring back those air traffic controllers that you furloughed. So this is a work in progress. As we see these things happen, I would hope that Congress will have the sense this year to say this isn't working. And eliminate it. But the law that we passed in 2012 says that this sequestration goes on for a number of years. So after we say to these federal agencies, by the way, we cut you back to 2012 level, now we're talking about cutting you back to 2010 level, and you're going to still have to deal with sequestration. So I think we're going to go into total ruin if we don't adjust this. What does it all mean to the state of California? Well, I've passed out a sheet of what the White House told Congress it would mean with across the back cuts. It's a couple of pages. But more importantly, if you really want to get academic about it and understand all the nuances, I've had the Library of Congress prepare this budget sequestration, selected program exemptions, and special rules that I've handed out. I don't know if I have one for everybody, but we brought some here, and we certainly can get more. And that is really the best explanation of it. Now, we exempted in sequestration some programs. We exempted the benefit program. So it isn't going to affect Social Security, isn't going to affect Medicare, isn't going to affect the veterans benefits and things like that, and salaries of all those departments. And the Defense Department, it doesn't affect their salaries for their personnel. But it does affect some of the esoteric contracting programs in Medicare. For example, across the board, the benefits go to the individual, but we also have money given to hospitals and to clinics. And that is affected by sequestration. So although the major Medicare payments aren't, the special Medicare funds are affected by sequestration. So that means it's going to affect our local institutions, and only they can tell us how that affects, because they have some ability to do some managing. So I think if you're looking for, you know, an easy answer, this is until our political structure changes and our priorities change, and the president's trying to, I mean, this is a really dumb thing to do. And it's just as dumb as somebody said, you got to just spend less on everything. You just say, I can't spend less on gasoline. They haven't lowered the price of per gallon of gas. I can't spend less on water. I mean, but that's what we're requiring people to do. So it is it's going to have all kinds of problems. I think that the best way to change politics is always bottoms up, because members of Congress, as they are in the state legislature, are represented by districts. Those districts hold their contract for renewal. Those contracts are up every 2 years at election time. And you have to be accountable to the people who elect you. You don't have to be accountable to your party leadership. You don't have to be accountable to the President of the United States. You got to be accountable to the people that elect you. And so the stories, because I think in this social media time when there's so damn much information out there, and people just get confused because never anything's ever put into context. It's always extremes. This is the end of the world with this happening. But I find what really is effective now is telling the story. And each of you will have a story about how these cuts, as you see them, are going to affect you. Not what somebody else says, but what you actually see with the money that you have. Now, Monterey County is going to be affected. There's no doubt about it. We receive roughly about $3.5 billion a year in federal money that comes in here through Medicare, through Social Security, veterans benefits, categorical programs, operation of the military, which is about $1.5 billion in this county. All that money is spent in this county. And I was talking, for example, to the director of WIC from Monterey County, and she was telling me all the benefits. I said, look, I love WIC. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. We administered programs like this in Latin America. I think it's a phenomenal program. Don't talk to me about the benefits of the program. How much money do you spend on WIC in Monterey County? What's your budget? She said, $20 million. I said, no, okay, $20 million. Where's that money spent? She said, those are vouchers given to the moms to go out and buy food. I said, well, where do they buy food? They're not going to buy food in San Francisco or Los Angeles. They're buying food in Salinas, probably, because that's where our WIC office, in Seaside, where our WIC offices are. I said, what if you went to the Chamber of Commerce and said, you know, they're going to take $20 million out of our local economy? People would be screaming. And I think that that's the way we have to change this dialogue from how much it costs. You know, if business comes to you, they don't talk about how much they spend. They talk about how much they invest. You are investing in people. That's what all of us in this room do. We invest our time, we invest our money in making quality of life better for us here. There's a huge value, an economic value to that. And we've got to, if we're really going to get government to be responsive, we've got to take it away from just talking about the fact that it spends too much and talk about the benefit that it gets from investing in people, investing in education, investing in social service programs. And that's the only way we're going to change the politic, to say these things are worth investing in, not just worth cutting, squeezing, and trimming. So we want to hear your stories. And as you tell those stories to elected officials, they've got to respond, because their contract's up for renewal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I neglected to introduce someone that I am very thankful has joined us today, and that's Supervisor Fernando Armenta, coming to us from the Salinas area, but I specifically am thankful that he's here with us as well as just another person who's learning about sequestration. Also wanted to thank Nicole Charles, who is Senator Bill Monning's district rep, for being here with us today. So thank you so much. And then going back to the comment, the document that you referenced, Sam, I think you said it was from the Library of Congress. We can work with Alec Orrego and make sure that we get that up on the United Way website, so you'll be able to find that article there as well. Our next speaker now is Captain Gerral David from the Navy Postgraduate School. His bio is in your folder, so I won't take our time to credit his past, but I'll tell you he's a great guy and does a lot of good work here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. If you'll bear with me a little bit, I want to tell you just a little about the big picture Navy nationally, and then tell you why I think it matters to you. So is that a fair deal? So sequestration affects our ability as a Navy to train our people, to maintain our force, and to invest in our future. It has an accumulating effect. So things that you defer now will cost you more later to get them back. And to give you an example, if you're a marathon runner and you train and you stay in shape, it's relatively easy to get ready for the next marathon. But if you lay off for 2 or 3 months, It may take you 5 or 6 or 7 months to get back in shape to where you were when you stopped. And that's what will happen with all of our DoD training. It's not we stop for a month and then after a month of money you're fixed. It will take you a lot longer than that to get back to where you were when you stopped. And that's an important thing to remember as we get into operational readiness deferral because of sequestration. So the Navy's annual cuts under sequestration are $10 to $15 billion annually. That's a little hard to get my mind around, so I don't even try. Our strategy will be to trade future capacity. What does future capacity mean? It means fewer people, fewer ships, fewer submarines, fewer aircraft, and we base our force structure on what we think it will take to fight whatever the next war is. So if you get smaller, you may have not quite enough of what you thought you needed for whatever the next war is. But we got to make that decision as Americans for what the right level of force is. The reason we're going to do that is we want whatever force size we have to be ready and capable to go fight that war, whatever that war is. You don't want to have too many people that aren't trained, because then it doesn't help you when you go into that circumstance. And we want to make sure that we do the appropriate investment into our future. You can't keep flying World War II era airplanes forever. You have to recapitalize those airplanes. You have to buy whatever the next thing is, otherwise you lose ground on the competition, right? So that's the big picture of the Navy. The other thing that's looming out there is furloughs. And Congressman Farr talked about this just a little bit. The Navy has advocated that we can avoid furloughs. We have acquisition programs, ships and submarines and aircraft that we can defer so that we can keep the human beings. And the reason that we want to do that, first, we care about the people, but it matters for operational readiness, because if we do a furlough, the people that are doing ship depot level maintenance and aircraft depot level maintenance are civilians. And so they won't be there. So that starts affecting your operational readiness, because those things aren't ready to deploy or train the troops when you need them to be there. We have civilians that run our simulators for aircraft. So if they're on furlough, I can't train a pilot to get ready to go on deployment. And so all of those things will matter to us. But the Army doesn't have an acquisition program that they can defer. That does not make the Army evil. I realize as a Navy captain, sometimes you might think I should say that. It does not make the Army evil, but they are a people-oriented business. And so the Army believes that they are going to have to enact a furlough. So now the Secretary of Defense has to decide, is he going to have us and them, those of us that don't have to furlough and them that do, or is he going to say we're all going to do the same thing? And right now that's where he has sat, is he said we're all going to do the same thing. So we think right now that we're going to furlough across all of DoD for about 14 days, depending on how that plays itself out. But that's all still in Secretary of Defense's hands. And we're going to do whatever the Secretary of Defense tells us to do, right? So when you hear all of those big things, you say, what do I care? That's not affecting Monterey, right? Because it doesn't sound like anything that I said affects Monterey. So my base operating budget, I run the Naval Support Activity Monterey, so I'm the landlord that has the ground for the Naval Postgraduate School, Fleet Numerical, and so I pay the bills in public works and grounds maintenance and a whole bunch of other things. I run about a $50 million a year business. My base operating support cuts this year, $6 million. And all of that is local jobs, because all of that is contractors that I hire to come onto the base to do work. We're deferring some special projects to the tune of $6.7 million. Again, people I would have hired to come into the base to do work. So that's $12.7 million this year that I'm not going to spend in the local economy that I would have hired people from outside the base to come in and work. So that matters to you. In that base operating support budget, Hope Janitorial is sitting here. We also have North Bay Industries does our grounds maintenance. That is a new normal. We are going to reduce our janitorial services. We're going to reduce our grounds maintenance. The amount of money that we take out of that contract means that those two companies are going to have about 20 full-time equivalents of people that I'm not going to pay on my base. So they're going to have to either find more work for those people or they're going to have to get rid of those people. That's a local company having to make a business decision based on what I can afford with your taxpayer dollars. So that's going to matter to you. So that's Department of Defense down to the guy cutting grass, right? So it's not just that big, how many ships and airplanes do we buy? Naval Postgraduate School. They are about $3.7 million down right now in about a $100 million budget. If we do the furlough, they'll lose another $3.7 million in salaries. So that's the Naval Postgraduate School locally. The interesting thing about the Naval Postgraduate School is that their indirect budget is 2 or 3 times the size of their direct budget. The direct budget is what we give the Naval Postgraduate School to run just all the time. The indirect budget is the reimbursable education that the Department of the Army may pay for people to come to school for cost management course, or it's reimbursable research that the Office of Naval Research may pay to go do this particular type of research, so you hire research assistants to do that. What we don't know locally is when the sequestration hits those organizations, how they will decide to spend that money at the Naval Postgraduate School or not. And so the uncertainty factor is really high on what's going to happen in the out years with that accumulating effect with the Office of Naval Research. Because if they find that they can do all the work in-house, then maybe they don't need to spend that money in Monterey on research. But we don't know what's going to happen there. It's easier, frankly, for me to plan on the loss of the $12.7 million I talked about, because at least I know what that is. It's really hard to plan on what the change will be. Year over year, the Naval Postgraduate School from last year to this year, their total budget, including everything, is about $45 million less than it was last year. Not all of that is sequestration led. It's cyclical because you have a program that lasts for a year and then it goes away and no new program comes in. But $45 million over a year change is pretty big change. So you need to be aware that that is out there. So I think I made the point that there's a significant labor impact that is here. Community relations. You probably read that we've grounded the Blue Angels, the Air Force has grounded the Thunderbirds, we're no longer doing fleet weeks, and so that becomes interesting. San Diego, there is a non-federal entity that runs San Diego Fleet Week. They're going to do San Diego Fleet Week without the Navy. So the Navy is home ported in San Diego with all those ships and submarines and aircraft, and we are not going to open the bases because we're not going to spend taxpayer dollars to do community relations in San Diego. So that's where we are. How does it affect you locally? In the paper, if you saw it, the Defense Language Institute just canceled their open house for Language Day. We, on the Navy side, just canceled the Memorial Day concert in the park. And those are relatively small things, but if you think about those types of things, if I'm not training people to be able to go on deployment to fight our nation's wars, if I'm not going on those deployments, how can I afford to spend money on community relations? So we're trying to get to the right place, but it means that there's going to be things that we just don't do that we would like to do, frankly. So that's $50 to the combined federal campaign. Sorry. Pavlovian, it happens. So when you're looking at furloughing people, you don't want to spend money in the wrong ways. So we're being careful about that. So we're looking at a new normal, and sequestration is driving us there. Even if you believe that the Department of Defense ought to be smaller, and I won't argue that point because that's a national debate that we need to all have. Even if you believe the Department of Defense needs to be smaller, you need to recognize that the impact is not just on those big corporate conglomerates that are building ships and airplanes. It really is the Hope janitorial worker and the North Bay Industries guy that's cutting the grass. It's the guy in Middle America that's building parts for a tank that is being affected by all of those things. And so you got to recognize this is a national issue, not just a guys wearing uniform issue. So as Americans, we've got to decide what our national priorities are. And as Congressman Farr said, sequestration is not the answer. And I will tell you, I am apolitical. You know, I'm in uniform, I'm not left or right, but I used to blame Congress for that. And turns out he's right. We choose as Americans because they get renewed all the time. And we have to choose what the right answer is and what our priorities are. And if we abdicate that choice, then we can't blame them for where we are. So we as Americans have got to start having a better public debate about what our future is. We can't afford business as usual. We've got to think about ways to be smarter about how to spend our taxpayer dollars. Fred Meurer and I talk about public-public partnerships, and I hope that Fred will talk a little bit more about that. We look at public-private partnerships where we do our housing area with a private vendor now. And we're starting to look at how to be smarter about the resources so we don't have overlapped resources that we spend. The Presidio of Monterey, the Army Garrison, and I talk about our overlapping services so that we have the capacity to handle all the people on both bases, but not overlapping capacity. Because it's your money, and we need to be careful about how we spend that. I told you I'm apolitical. But we have got to, as Americans, we've got to decide that we cannot afford to spend all the money that we spend on entitlements right now. And that means that some of the non-federal entities are going to have to pick up some of those entitlements that the federal government no longer has. That makes people on the left side of the political spectrum a little unhappy. We cannot afford not to raise revenue. And that makes people on the right side of the political spectrum unhappy. But if we're Americans, we've got to figure out the right way to do that. And so we've got to all get closer to the middle and stop being politically divided on things. We've got to get over the not in my backyard-ism kind of things. And we've got to figure out how to be Americans. And I'm proud of being an American. And I think that we are perfectly capable of figuring out a solution that is not sequestration, that gets us within our budget so that we can pay our way and we can be that beacon that we ought to be globally. So you ought to be proud of what you do too. I appreciate y'all having me here, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much. That was just very well put. I really appreciate it a lot. You think about all of the things that create the fabric of our community, and things like the concerts at MPS really do that, and Fleet Week. So thank you for bringing it to our attention. Our next speaker, in order, I think, then, will be Fred Meurer, City Manager of Monterey since 1991.
As some of you know, I'm retired Army. So I want to say we are very lucky to have Gerral David here. He has been an extraordinary installation commander, and I've had the privilege of seeing probably 30 different Army or Navy colonels or captains in the Navy talk come here. And Gerral is amongst the best that we have ever had in terms of his ability to I'll call it articulate the needs of the Navy while totally understanding the needs of this community. And we're just really blessed to have him here. Hopefully we can steal him if he ever decides to put on civilian clothes. I think most people would say that sequestration is absolutely idiotic. It is an absolute total abandonment of leadership. At the same time, I am guessing that there are some people that are saying, it's working. Because as you probably realize, there is a segment of the political family of the United States that believes government is the problem. And you solve the problem by starving the beast. It goes back primarily to the Reagan administration. We saw it when he was governor. Barbara today, with interim, is dealing with decisions made in California when Reagan was governor with regards to, are we going to, as a public, care for our marginally mentally ill, or are we going to put them on the streets of our state? As a state, we decided we were going to put them out on the streets. So we shouldn't be surprised when they're out there. We need to totally applaud and commend Interim and many of the other service providers for having the courage and the energy to scrape together the resources to attack the problem, even though they know we don't have the resources to solve the problem. Sequestration itself in this state, at least for the city of Monterey, is sort of more of the same. I got to tell you, our own legislature did it to us just a year ago. Exactly the same thing. They didn't call it sequestration. They called it getting rid of redevelopment agencies and taking many of the resources of redevelopment agencies to pay obligations of the state because the state didn't want to take on creating the revenue to pay their obligations. So on top of losing, the city of Monterey has lost millions and millions and millions of dollars to the state of California. We have written multiple checks to the state as a result of the state coming to the conclusion that those were redevelopment dollars. Therefore, they belong to the state, and the state will apply them to the state's obligations rather than the city applying them to the city's obligations. An example, over the years, the city of Monterey made a decision that we, instead of selling bonds to fund the capital improvements that have made Canterbury Row what it is today, or that have transformed the downtown, or that has helped us pay for the sports center or our senior programs, our senior center, that the general fund would make the loans to the redevelopment agency. And we would book those as loans, and the redevelopment agency over time, through tax increment, would pay those loans back. Well, as part of the state legislature's decision-making, they said, we don't recognize those contracts. So that $4+ million a year that the city had in a loan repayment from the redevelopment agency is gone. $4 million a year that was spent on social service programs, fixing our streets, and providing other services ranging from library services to firefighters to cops to the janitors, our custodians taking care of our buildings. So we need to look across the board because this infection that we as a nation have right now, that we just hate taxes, we don't trust government, and therefore we're not going to provide the government money to provide services, is something we've had for a long time, and we got to find a way to fix. Because as Gerral says, while it may, $4 million for me is more than I can contemplate, really. I mean, that's a lot of dollar bills stacked up. But I know that ripples through and equals jobs in our community. I know after the state took our money away, I had to sit down with 4 of my employees, the first time in my 22 years as city manager that I've actually had to face an employee and say, I am sorry, but I have to lay you off. Knowing that they had mortgages, they had children, they had families to take care of. And why them? Because I could find that service cheaper in the private sector. This is my urban forestry crew. Because that private sector contract did not have retirement benefits and health care benefits like the city of Monterey does. Bless the contractor. The contractor said, I will offer your employees jobs. So at least I was able to ensure they had a job. But that's just a microcosm of what decisions made in Sacramento or decisions made in Washington mean to the person on the street. It is hurting families that have worked their backsides off to survive. But we're just at that tipping point that we have so eroded the various safety nets, people are going to start falling through. Now, some would say it is working because the government didn't close down And by the way, if it's too inconvenient for some, we'll figure out how to fix it, like the controllers. And we found a way to fix that in a heartbeat. Are we going to find a way to fix the fact that there are some kids in Head Start that aren't having a breakfast this morning or some other program? That's not an inconvenience to those in power. It is certainly an inconvenience to those educators and those families who are working so desperately to survive. So it's a huge issue, and it is this balance between, as Captain David said, looking to the future. We are eating our seed corn. I'm doing exactly the same thing because I no longer have that $4 million. That's $4 million I am not reinvesting in the streets of Monterey, in the buildings of Monterey, and so on. It very often comes out of maintenance. So at the very time we've lost the money to the state, we also get word from the Army that the contract we have with them is going to be reduced about 32%. $1.9 million between now and the end of their fiscal year. Not a huge amount of money, but for the folks who were being paid their salary out of that $1.9 million, it is a huge amount of money. Now, we had thought ahead. We started with a hiring freeze months ago because I anticipated this happening. While people said, this is so stupid, it'll never happen, I wasn't that sure. And it's always a lot easier to hire people than to lay people off. So I put in a hiring freeze. And I also started doing my own little sequester of taking jobs that I was going to contract out to the private sector and momentarily setting them aside so I could reallocate my workmen that had been doing work for the Army to small city projects so I could keep them employed. But what have I done? I have caused some laborer in the private sector, some carpenter in the private sector not to have a job because we didn't contract out. But my greatest worry is that folks will say, well, it didn't hurt me. And the problem is, as Sam said, we're not doing a good enough job as government or as nonprofits or as community members of demanding from our elected leaders that they look to the future. They are being blinded by the last phone call and what do I need to do to take care of this constituent or what do I need to do to appear popular enough to get reelected, as opposed to making a decision that says I am willing to be unelected because it is the right thing to do. It is for the future of our city, the future of our state, or the future of our federal government. I am so very, very fearful that as we continue to cut the safety nets, as we continue to cut our investments in our people, in our education systems, in our infrastructure, we are going to the return to the United States of the 60s, where folks lost hope, hope turned to hatred, hatred turned to violence. And then we woke up one day and said, why is this happening in Watts? Why is this happening in Detroit? Why is this happening within sight of the nation's capital? It happened because we were not willing to invest in our people and invest in the future. We've got to do that. This is our opportunity to use this crisis for good because it gives us the opportunity, as Sam has asked us all to do, put a big spotlight on the stupidity of this, put a big spotlight on how this is hurting everyday Americans who are out there trying to survive and take care of their families. So, thank you.
Really valuable. Our next speaker is Norm Groot. Norm is head of the Monterey County Farm Bureau and has an accounting background. He worked for many years in the nursery business. He now serves on the Salinas Valley Chamber of Commerce Board, and I'm very thankful that you could come and join us today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm pleased to be here to speak on this particular subject. And when I started thinking about how I was going to frame the comments relating to agriculture and the cuts that we're facing at the Department of Agriculture, I thought I needed to take this maybe to a little bit better level than just listing a whole bunch of numbers and facts and figures of programs that are going to be affected, and really take it, as others have said here, is what are our national priorities at this point? And I personally, being involved in agriculture, think that our food supply is a national priority. We need to have a safe and reliable domestic food supply here in order to feed our hungry nation. Everyone likes to eat, I think. But I think it's very important that we look at it in the aggregate of what that means to our national security and really what we can produce for our citizens here. So I think I would take it more in the aggregate of, do we really appreciate all that our farmers and ranchers do for us in providing food at our supermarkets and our restaurants and wherever else we decide to eat it? And how do we frame that in particular when we're facing some of these cuts? And I will agree, I think sequestration is a poor choice. I don't think it's anything that you would find a farmer or rancher wildly jumping up and down about, even though agriculture as a whole is a very conservative community and really wants restraint in government and restraint in government spending. But we agree this is really not the way to approach it. So looking at it from that standpoint, when you look at the way USDA is going to be forced to handle that, and that's Department of Agriculture, the reality is that their reductions in their cuts are really a reduction in projected increases in spending year over year, as was described earlier. This is really a reduction in that inflationary situation that we have in government, where programs cost more each year because there's additional costs, those fixed costs go up, and really we need to look at how we manage those from year to year in a different manner than what we're trying to do here. The sequester cut within USDA, their share is $2.5 billion projected for this year. They're on track to spend a budget of about $155 billion annually at this point, and that's really out of a budget of $147 billion. So you can see they're already over budget. And what this really means is that the sequestration really means they're only going to be going over budget by $5 billion this year. So, but when you take it in the aggregate of where we are with inflation and the additional costs, and that things cost a whole lot more from year to year, even though we don't really have that much of an inflationary index in the last year, it really means a lot. So fiscal constraint then gets defined as a limitation of really just how much you're going to go over budget and where you're going to make those cuts. So what is USDA doing to propose their reductions in expenditures at first? What we heard first, which hasn't gotten as much publicity as the air traffic controllers, but we did hear that they were going to target the meat inspection program, and they're going to reduce the amount of meat inspectors and furlough some of those people. And that would have put a real crimp in our food supply as far as what fresh meats would be available for the consuming public. And that changed, obviously, when Congress acted and decided that that wasn't really necessarily a good idea. Let's keep the food moving to the people who need to eat. So now what they're doing is they've decided that they're going to make some direct cuts in payments of programs to farmers that are part of the Farm Bill or the Farm Program every year. And we have a 5-year Farm Bill that's been up for renewal, and we hope that we can get to that point this year. But those are programs that are established in place that help farmers manage their crops, manage their particular finances each year, and really get them to the point where they have some certainty from year to year that they're going to be viable. And we're talking big crops here. We're talking corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, and cotton. And really a lot of their operating loans that they can get depend each year on how viable they are, and a lot of that is due to these direct payments. So they proposed originally a 5.1% cut to these direct payments to all those farmers who are in those particular programs and would need to take advantage of those programs. And they've already paid out some of that money earlier this year, so the result is we've already paid some people. How do we get that 5.1% back from those people that already got that money? Well, that's not really fair to those who already have received it and maybe even spent it. So now the discussion is, can we institute an 8.5% cut for the remaining people, the farmers who have not received their payments yet this year? And that's a big hit. I mean, that's almost a 10% hit in annual income for some of these farms. So it's something that I think we all need to think about in the aggregate terms. And these producers have already made plans and commitments for this year, planting their crops. Most of them are in the ground already. And now they're faced with this 8.5% possible reduction. So at what point do we say that having a sustainable farming community is important to us, not only as a county here, where we have 4.0 billion in agricultural production locally, that means more or less 8.2 billion in impacts to our local economy every year, but how do we relate to that on a national scale, and how does that work? Because we obviously don't have very much corn and wheat and soybeans here in Monterey County, but everything is all interrelated. All those crops impact other industries, they impact transportation, they impact supplies for retailers. It all comes into this big circle where everything is interconnected. And within the agricultural community, if you have someone who's in the Midwest suddenly who has become unsustainable in producing corn, and they're going to start looking at something else that they can grow that really will be sustainable and will get them to the point where they can be profitable year in and year out. So that adds additional pressure to those crops that are already producing supplies that are in the marketplace. And while I don't think there's any great danger that Kansas is suddenly all of a sudden going to become a lettuce producer, I think there is some concern that we could move some of those crops into other areas that traditionally have not had competition for, say, Monterey County products. So I think that's a bigger concern of how we interrelate all of the crops and the production values that we have for some of these larger corn and grain type crops. So how does this really come down to affecting us here in Monterey County, where we really don't have a whole lot of program dollars that come into farmers here? We are not generally on the federal payroll, so to speak, for our crops. So how does this really affect us? And there's a small portion of the USDA budget that goes to other programs for what we call the specialty crops. Those are the vegetables and the leafy greens, the strawberries, the lettuces, the things that we produce here. We have a problem here in California with invasive pests. We bring in a lot of pests through various different sources, most of them illegal, into our state, and then we have to start dealing with them. And I'll use the example of light brown apple moth, which several years ago was discovered here in Santa Cruz County, and we had a chance to eradicate it, but we didn't quite get there. And so we're now in a maintenance program of trying to control this. And a lot of that burden falls on the producers and the growers in the area, but a lot of it also has to come from federal and state dollars. The state made a decision several years ago that they weren't going to fund this program, so now all the dollars come from the federal program for invasive pests. And if we start seeing reductions in those programs, what does that mean for not only our producers here, but for our environment if we allow an invasive pest to take hold in our environment? So I think there's bigger concerns that go just beyond looking at a program and deciding we're going to cut some dollars when really we have much larger issues at stake. Another question that I have in my mind is how we're going to implement the Food Safety Modernization Act. If you all recall, back in 2010, President Obama signed a large piece of legislation that basically modernizes our food safety measures and basically takes what we've done here in Monterey County and makes it a model for the United States. We had a very good voluntary program that has worked for 5-6 years here in this area, and now other producers across the country are really going to have to follow suit. This is going through an implementation process. It's currently in a public comment period, and while it's been delayed because this is such a complex, really involved process when you have hundreds of different commodities involved, and how do you establish food safety patterns or best management practices for all those crops, it really takes time to get there. And if we don't have the dollars to properly implement this, we're going to have a lot of unintended consequences, and we really don't want to take that risk with our food supply at this point. So I think it's important to consider that as we move along and we all say we want safe food and we want to make sure that we're producing it in a manner in which that we can rely on it, and we go to the store and don't even have to think about it because that's what most people do at this point. But we need to look at it in terms of what producers have to do and how much it's going to cost them in the long run. And if it's a poorly implemented and maintained program, we need to get through that process and do it in a proper manner. Locally here, I'll just touch real quick on one of the sequestration issues that my organization became involved with Congressman Farr's office was the closure of the Salinas Tower operations at the airport. That operation may not necessarily be a commercial airport, but it's extremely important to our agricultural industry here because we have a number of operators who work out of that airport who provide protection for our crops in the local Salinas Valley, as well as Santa Cruz and San Benito counties. So it's important that we maintain those operations, that those people can get their helicopters off the ground when they need to, and that they're not arbitrarily hampered by a whole bunch of new rules and a control tower that operates from hundreds of miles away and tells them how they can fly. So it's very important to keep our local economy thriving by keeping our healthy agricultural industry moving forward. So I'll just summarize real quick here and say that I think we have a lot of programs within USDA. WIC was mentioned earlier about the food assistance programs. That's a large dollar amount of people that are on food stamps, and the WIC program at this point, it's somewhere upwards of 45 million people. Those people do buy food, and they are part of the consuming public. And if we start making additional cuts there without really looking at how we're going to handle those in the aggregate, we may impact our food supplies and really determine whether or not people are going to be able to eat. So I think that's an important consideration to look at, and how we manage that program and how far do we want to take that program in the future. So I'll summarize just by saying that I think everything's interconnected with our food supply, and we really need to be very aware that there's a lot of things going on that threaten farmers, whether it's financially or from an economic or even environmental impact from pests, diseases, whatever it may be. I think we really all need to really have a new appreciation for what agriculture does in providing us food every day. And I think that's all part of our local community because agriculture drives the county economy at this point. And if we can't keep that healthy and keep that moving forward, then I think we're all in for a little bit more than we expect at this point. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Norm, representing probably our most significant economic driver here. Thank you very much. Now we have Elliott Robinson, Director of Social and Employment Services for Monterey.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see actually so many people, one, interested in this topic, and two, who I actually recognize. And I have to confess that last night when I was trying to struggle with how do I start making comments about sequester, it's always hard to figure out how you start making comments. So I thought, and then I kind of got stuck on, well, the word sequester. And I began thinking quite literally about what does that word mean? And I always thought of it in terms of a jury being sequestered, something that was being separated and isolated, kept apart from a larger whole, but then in time it would be reunited. In fact, as I understand it from a report I heard a few months back while listening to KZU on the way home from work, the Latin roots of the word mean to separate and keep safe in place. Now, though, the word seems to mean something completely different. Frankly, I wish I knew the Latin word for eliminate and indiscriminately dispose of. Somehow I think that whatever that word is, we should ask Congress to use that one next time they find themselves compelled by a divided constituency to play a game of chicken with our country's finances and the livelihoods of so many individual Americans. Okay, now that I got that off my chest, enough about language. And by now, we all know the sequester word and have gotten used to its new meaning. So I'll get off the soapbox and take a little bit of time to go over what I know about how the sequester is impacting our local human services system. Keep in mind, though, that the sequester is confusing, even for those among us who are pretty good at deciphering federal funding streams. And frankly, in far too many areas, we're still waiting for actual numbers. So kind of to put context on that, I'm someone who always looks for the best in people. And I like to think the numbers are coming out so slowly, frankly, because people at all levels of government, from state to local to federal, are struggling with just how to put into place these across-the-board funding reductions that aren't very smart and that I'm sure we all kind of dread. So before I start going into actually impacted programs and cuts, I want to list off some of the major programs that I pay attention to that are not impacted by the sequester. And that's a really important equation because you hear this big, scary, daunting word of across-the-board cuts, but there are some key programs that aren't impacted. So the Medi-Cal program, which so many rely on for basic health care. So many of our low-income families rely on for basic health care. That is not being cut at the kind of the core level, although there are Medi-Cal-related programs that do fall into the discretionary world. CalFresh, also known as food stamps or supplemental nutrition assistance at the federal level, is not being cut. CalWorks, known as TANF at the federal level, that's not being cut. Foster care and the case management of child welfare programs, that's not being impacted by the sequester. Supplemental security income is not being impacted by the sequester. Child support enforcement, child nutrition programs, the commodity supplemental food program, mandatory funding under the Child Care and Development Fund, but the discretionary side of it is subject to reductions. Federal Pell Grants, which pay for so many low-income students to go to college, and programs administered by the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I have to thank you for that document you handed out. I actually found that on the internet last night and just kind of cut and paste from that. So these are, for the most part, these are mandatory programs and not impacted by the sequester. So in the Department of Social Services, at the county level, our federally funded programs largely fall into that list of mandatory programs. So in the context of our local budget, that's nearly $170 million, the actual cuts are not massive. But that being said, they will have a significant, the cuts that do happen will have a significant impact on our community partners who work with us so closely on prevention and senior services. And they will have an even deeper impact on individuals who relied on that support that is being cut and will no longer be available. So now let me go through a list of areas where, what I know, basically. So in aging programs, we have had to put into place a $33,000 cut covering just the last 3 months of this fiscal year, April through the end of June. And concretely, this is resulting in a suspension of contract services for home care, which is an extremely reliable, valuable resource for our social workers who are going out and working to resolve adult protective services concerns. It is also resulting in this 3-month period in the suspension of another contract that supports transportation needs of seniors. So then as we approach the new fiscal year, starting in July, we expect to see the cut in aging services grow to $100,000 a year. And that will have deeper impacts. That will include senior nutrition programs. We expect the reduction in funding for senior nutrition programs will result in 100 fewer meals per day for low-income seniors. We expect reductions in adult daycare services, reductions in support for grandparent caregivers, and for health promotion services. And that's in addition to the cuts I already mentioned in home care services and transportation. So next, going down the list, in my department, there's community action programs. We're still waiting word from the state on exactly how and when reductions will be allocated. We don't know that number yet. But based on the policy of sequester, we expect to see $25,000 less for contracts with community-based nonprofits. So that will impact nonprofits who are already struggling to put together a base budget and to remain sustainable. In child abuse prevention programs, we expect to see a reduction of approximately $38,000, which will weaken our efforts to provide community members with information they need to identify and report child maltreatment, which is a key part of prevention from anything from gang violence to bad outcomes for children, childhood tragedy. Having a community that's aware of child abuse, that knows to report child abuse, and that gives us the opportunity to make sure that it's not happening and to prevent its treatment is critical. So that's it in the Department of Social Services. But I have to tell you, it'd be irresponsible of me to stop with that narrow view of the programs that we operate. Because as a Department of Social Services, we serve and promote community well-being in the context of partnership with so many others. So let me highlight some additional impacts that will take a toll on community well-being. In the Women, Infants, and Children's program, which you've heard about already, they're expecting to see a 5.1% cut in their annual allocation. So for operations, that's about $214,000, which will eliminate the ability to reach out to reach and serve the community. And then when you take that same reduction and bring it into the actual value of vouchers, and this is something the health department is still waiting to hear how exactly is it going to be impacted. But if you take that reduction into vouchers, low-income women and their children under 5 will likely see this key nutritional support reduced by about $660,000 locally. With regard to our educational system, I understand, and Mary talked about this a little bit earlier today, that Monterey County schools stand to lose more than $6 million. And you have two impacts there. You have the direct impact on student services, on learning, on childhood well-being, and on growth. But you also have a political impact, where there are so many people who voted for Proposition 30, anticipating that school funding would be sustained, maybe even optimistically grow, and now that hope for state sustenance for schools is going to be eroded by the federal disinvestment. And that erosion will take kind of particular aim at the Head Start program, at migrant education, and keep in mind that Monterey County has the largest migrant education program in the state. It will also affect special education. So big impacts in education to watch out for at the very time when, as a state, we voted for improvement. And the big challenge is that often leaves voters confused. They say, I voted for some improvement, but now what's happening? Why isn't that occurring? Surely I don't trust the public sector anymore. And we have to prevent that distrust from occurring. The Housing Authority, which has been extremely underfunded over the past decade, is seeing an 8% cut in funding for their voucher programs and a 31% cut in the resources they need to operate the program. On top of that, a year from now, we're expecting additional cuts of about $90,000 to our network of homeless services providers if the sequester continues. So that's in the housing realm. The workforce investment system and the one-stop career centers are anticipating reductions in funding of over $300,000 in the new fiscal year. This includes a reduction in youth employment services, which are so needed as we address the issue of youth violence in our community. A reduction in youth employment services funding of about $181,000, which is roughly 11% of our youth employment program in Monterey County. Next, I want to talk about unemployment insurance. So, as of last Monday, Californians who have been unemployed for more than 6 months will be getting a 17.7% cut in their weekly unemployment benefits. The state estimates that the average long-term unemployed Californian will lose roughly $52 a week. And if you put that in the context of the state's maximum benefit being $450 per week, a recipient who's receiving that benefit of $450 per week can expect to see a trim of $79 in their benefits. That's a pretty large amount of money when you're trying to keep a household budget together. So from all we've gone over this morning, it seems pretty clear that these reductions add up. They will have deep impacts on individuals who lose works as contracts are cut. They will also weaken the very fabric of our community as people needing support lose the services and resources they need to sustain themselves and their families in an economy that is still very difficult. It makes me want to look up that word that means eliminate and indiscriminately dispose of, and shake some sense into the collective whole of our Congress. The idea of trusteeship and safekeeping that the word sequester implies would be fine, but that's not the policy that was enacted. In our economy today, we see an unemployment rate that is 12.5% here at home. For the state, it's 9.4%, and nationally, it's 7.6%. In our community at large, more than 17% of our neighbors have incomes that are under the poverty level. And that statistic becomes more dire when you look at children, where nearly 1 in 4 children in our community lives in poverty. With that, I want to leave you with the less than optimistic notion that unless we achieve some momentum for good public policy, like that airline passengers achieved, real people, maybe some among us today, and certainly some of our neighbors and fellow community members, real people will face losing the opportunity that is so important to us all and so important to our way of life. And the very recovery which we have all been working so hard to sustain faces a brand new risk. Now, I can't just end on a bad note. But it's a real bad note. But I do want to say, at the same time, I am optimistic at my core that we all will and we need to embrace that very resilience which has carried us through the last 5 years, and that we all need to be encouraged, and we all need to do everything we can to leave no stone unturned in keeping the recovery we see today on track. That's the most important thing, and we all need to work for that recovery because it's making a difference today, and we need to have it keep making a difference. We need to make sure it keeps growing, and we need to make sure our Congress works alongside of us as people. So, thank you.
I think what we'll do, I'll pose the question, and the four of you can just choose to answer as you wish. Not everybody may want to comment on everything. Fatima is walking through collecting other questions from the audience as well. But the first question that I'd like to ask is that what can we as individuals do to help make change here?
Well, there's two sides, I think, two answers to that question. One is the professional side of you, which, as a collective room, we ought to be going out and doing an inventory on everything that you have in your shop as to sophistication of equipment and personnel skills. Because if we all knew what everybody has, when we have shortages, there is excess capacity. There's always excess a bit of time. Somebody has some time to lend with those skills or equipment that isn't being utilized. We've done that with the military and pulling it all together. The Army didn't talk to the Navy, and the Navy didn't talk to the reservists, and the reservists didn't talk to the National Guard. We put together a thing called Team Monterey, and all of the commands came together and sort of laid out what they do in their mission and what they have. And we found millions and millions of dollars of savings where they didn't have to go to Washington to get money to fix a problem. I think we don't do that in government enough, and I'm going to work on getting all the rest of the federal agencies in this county to do kind of a team approach. But I think particularly in our community service and nonprofits, we're all in our own silos. And it would really be worthwhile to find out what is the capacity, both in equipment, supplies, and personnel that all of you have, so that a problem can be fixed by sharing, rather than having to go out and get more money to fix the problem. That's the one side, the business side. I think the other side is the personal side, and that's political. You're people, you vote, you get involved, and this is politics, and we've got to begin being, and I don't know whether I'm preaching to the choir in California, because this state actually went through that revote last election, and probably the first state in the union that had a statewide election to increase taxes, because the legislative body wouldn't do it. And the governor indicated that he wouldn't raise taxes without a vote of the people, but he had to go the hard route to get that measure on the ballot, and the voters voted for it. Because we've seen enough of California living under sequestration or cut, squeeze, and trim, furloughs, and all those things. So I think that the politics of that is starting to advocate that, look, moderation is, we're gonna have savings. We're gonna be smart about how we spend money, but at the same time, we got to be smart of how we clean up our tax code, and we've got to have some adjustments in that tax code. We have oil taxes that were set in the 1950s. We subsidize oil companies, allow them to have deductions from 1950. Nobody's reviewed that and said, does that make sense now with some of these companies being the most profitable in the world? Maybe there's some adjustments needed. But if you've signed a pledge saying no new taxes no matter what, don't confuse me with the facts, you're not going to get there. So the political side of you has got to also speak out. And in ending of that, what's interesting about all the panelists today is that they all contract. They don't contract with government, they contract with private sector to do the laundry, to clean the buildings, to buy the cement, to buy the asphalt for the city. Everybody here is contracting with a business around here. Those businesses who have to make a profit are all of a sudden going to be losing income. And they've got to be, that private sector has got to be part of the business community, has got to be part of this dialogue in advocating let's have a more rational approach to revenue in this country and to make those revenue adjustments, tax increases, if you will, in certain categories. So those are my recommendations.
Thank you, Sam. Any other comments?
I'd like to cheer off what Sam said about relooking how we do things, because the past few years in Monterey, actually dating back to about 1993, when we were in the midst of saying goodbye to the soldiers at Fort Ord and on the cusp of trying to defend against the closure of DLI, we as a city realized that we needed to approach how we did things in a totally different way. And as Sam said, we started looking across boundaries, public agency to public agency, and asking ourselves, do we really, really have to do it ourselves? Is there a way of teaming with others? Is there a way of reducing the cost of government while maintaining excellent service? The answer to that was, and still is, yes. There's more we can do, even though we have done a lot. I don't know how many of you live in the city of Monterey, but over the last 4 or so years, we have reduced the number of employees in the city of Monterey by 100. But I challenge you to detect a significant service impact that is really hitting you. Now, there are some out there. I do have fewer police officers. I do have fewer library hours. But all in all, we're still doing a pretty darn good job, even though we have less than 100 less people to do it. And the question, of course, is how did we do it? Well, one of the things we did is we looked to the military, and as a city, we decided that part of our mission as a city of Monterey was to do everything we could do to increase the mission effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of the military activities in Monterey. Sam Farr's first piece of legislation was a demonstration authority in 1994, impacting the 1995 law, that allowed in Monterey County, California, for installation commanders to buy municipal and utility services from local municipalities and cities. So over time, we have formed a very strong relationship with the Presidio of Monterey. Last year, we did almost $20 million worth of work for the Army. The Army told their chain of command that they received that work 22% less costly than their alternative means of acquisition. And that work yielded just under $1 million of reimbursable overhead to the city of Monterey that allowed us to invest in library hours and so on. When I got here a long time ago as an Army colonel, we had a Monterey Fire Department, a Navy Fire Department, Pacific Grove Fire Department, Carmel Fire Department, each with their own chief, deputy chief, training chiefs, division commanders, and so on. Now we have one department. We have gone together as a group, and there is one fire department with one fire chief, no training chief, a deputy chief, and 3 division chiefs. But we have been able to sustain our engine companies in the positions that we needed to sustain them in. So yesterday, when we had to respond due to multiple activities happening simultaneously, we were able to do it under the command of a single chief. We are talking with the city of Pacific Grove right now and the city of Seaside. Can we combine our police departments? We're already sharing many of the services. We caught the perpetrator yesterday in less than an hour through a collaborative work between the City of Monterey, City of Carmel, City of Pacific Grove, and City of Seaside Police, through an organization that we've just very quietly created that's called Prevent. So there are things. So we do need to take advantage of this crisis to do some things that are a little hard to do. Everybody liked having their own fire department, but we got to the point we couldn't afford it. And we asked the real question is, how do we cost effectively provide the firefighters on the ground and eliminate the duplicative overhead? as Gerral said, he has worked very, very closely with the Army to look at where do we have duplicate overhead? Where can we trim the costs while not impacting mission capability? So we need to keep doing that.
You know, Fred, forgive me, I think that that's really a good point for those of us in the room who work in the nonprofit industry to think as well. I think all of us look around and we're in sort of silos. I like to think that we have a collaborative culture here in Monterey County, but I think all of us know that there is some duplication of effort here, and perhaps the future that we should be looking at is what can we do as nonprofits to work together more effectively. I'm going to shift to a second question, if you don't mind, and go in a little bit of a different direction. It's sort of a three-part question. And the first part is, how permanent are the sequester cuts? And if sequestration continues, and this is the new way of doing business, what does the future hold?
I think sequestration will go away. Having said that, the new normal is the new normal, because we cannot afford to keep doing business the way we're doing it. So we'll call it something different, but we're going to have to change what our revenue streams are nationally and locally and federally. We're going to have to change what our entitlement programs are. And some of that means exactly what I said, which is as we change entitlements, the non-federal entities throughout our nation are going to have to pick up some of the slack that the federal government used to pick up or the local government used to pick up. Mary's right. If you look at the Combined Federal Campaign or any of the other organizations that do charitable donations, there's so much overlap out there that we've really got to get at an efficient organization in the business of our non-federal entities. And so we really need to look at that. I briefly mentioned national priorities, and I want to tell you something that Captain Wayne Porter put together. He worked on a national strategy. And what Wayne talked about was prosperity and security are enduring national interests. That's what we're all about. We want the planet to be better for our children than we found it. And there are three things that really tie into that. And the first is education. We can't ignore the education, which is our future, that makes us competitive globally and creates that innovative edge. So we've got to invest in education. We have to. The second is security. And you think as a military guy I would say that, but I don't just mean freedom from attack. I mean freedom from economic collapse and freedom from pandemic diseases and freedom from hateful ideology. So security is that I want to be able to live in my house and not feel concerned about anything. And then energy, access and development of clean, renewable resources. We have an opportunity in our country to have a new economic model. I mean, think about the Eisenhower highway system and how that completely changed our country. What if we did that for electricity? We actually figured out how to get clean energy all the way across our country instead of what we do now, which is develop it locally and then waste it if we can't get it moved somewhere. And so we really need to look at that. We need to look at our food distribution systems. And finally, we need to demand of Congress that our public policy, both domestically and foreign, align to those priorities. Because if you look at our domestic policy and our foreign policy, sometimes they're very disconnected on what our national priorities are. So the answer to your first question, which is what can we do individually, demand of all of us that are public servants, including me, that we treat the federal budget just like you treat your home budget. You make X amount of money, you don't spend X plus Y amount of money. So just demand that of all of us, and we'll get better as a nation. Thanks.
If I could, you know, Mary said something really, really important, and this duplication of effort. At our city council meeting that will be whatever the third Tuesday of this month is, we're going to talk a whole lot about homelessness. And what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to it? You know, part of the community says just make them disappear. Other part of the community says make life for them as comfortable as you possibly can. The answer is somewhere in between. But who should do it? There's going to be a public policy debate at our city council. From my perspective, there should be the debate. Do we as a city do it? Do we create new overhead, new positions to do homeless type programs? Or do we look to the current set of nonprofits and look at further resourcing them? Because again, I have pressures within, say, you know, city, you do it, you create the positions. I'm asking myself, couldn't we be more effective by providing the existing providers with more resources if, in fact, we're going to invest more resources?
You're not going to get any complaints about that from this crowd, I can tell you, Fred. Thank you.
But the topic won't be discussed unless you show up and participate, and it goes back to what Gerral said.
Thank
You've
you.
got to make your voices heard, or the decision makers can't hear you.
So mark your calendars, the Monterey City Council. Fred? Excuse me, Norm?
I'll just add that I don't paint as rosy a picture about sequester and how it's going to affect agriculture moving forward. And part of that, I think, is because of the highlight of the dysfunction and the paralysis that this really brings to light from what's going on in Washington, D.C. And I'll equate that to the farm bill that we currently have up for renewal. It was up for renewal. It's been extended twice now. It's a 5-year program. It's now into its 7th or almost 8th year of this existing program. And as an agricultural community, we came out and said, you know, these are things that we should change within the farm bill that will not only save money, but make everyone more efficient as we go through the process. And we haven't been able to get that done in Washington, D.C. And so that's why I'm a little fearful that now sequester is going to be used as this hatchet job on agriculture at USDA, and this is going to become the de facto farm bill moving forward. So I think we really all need collectively to raise our voices and say, you know, what are our national priorities? Where can we really save money? And let's move something forward for the greater good. So I would challenge that for all of us as voters here in Monterey County, and I'm not going to throw Sam Farr under the bus because I think he gets it, and I think he understands what we're trying to do as a community here. But there are others in Congress who do not and stand in the roadblock of trying to get some of these efficiencies done. So I would just challenge all of us as individuals to make our priorities known and kind of collectively raise our voices about this.
Thank you.
Thank you. You know, a couple things on the permanence and what happens if it continues. You know, that's kind of like, what's the crystal ball really look like, and who knows? But I will say, you know, we're kind of at a balancing point right now where we see a recovery that's real. Claims for unemployment, I can't remember, last quarter, were down nationally. The deficit ceiling debate, which we expected this summer, seems like it's not going to occur till the fall. So the economy is growing. The national debt is really shrinking. That's really good news. And, you know, in the ideal world, perhaps the permanence of the sequester debate becomes moot. If the economy grows, it's a moot point. Because the economy is growing, there will be more resources to fund. Maybe there's some pressure off of the budget itself. So my prognostication is pay a lot of attention to the economy. I often think of the FDR quote on, you know, the only thing to fear is fear itself. And certainly, you know, that's a little bit naive, but we do have to stay engaged. We have to promote that recovery because that's really what we want. You know, people don't want to be on public assistance. The folks who come into my office seeking CalFresh, the folks seeking CalWorks, the folks seeking general assistance, they're not looking to get something for free. They're struggling with a decision on how do they support themselves and how do they support their family. People want to work. And so anything we can do as individuals, anything we can do as policymakers to promote that recovery, absolutely essential.
Thank you. And on that optimistic note, and note of encouragement, yet again, I'll draw our Sequestration Summit to a close with tremendous thanks to our panelists. Thanks also to Congressman Sam Farr for the great work that he's done. And to all of you, too, for coming, for being here. I'm sorry if your questions weren't answered, but I do think, as we started out, this was an opportunity for us to learn. And I think all of us just picked up a little bit more information than what we had before. And I thank you all so much for being here to help us with it. Thank you.